Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast in which Craig Touch and myself, and apparently my cat, chat to some of the interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry of writing and publishing. Today, we are delighted to have a very interesting man. I believe that he is originally one of my countrymen who has made the way across the Atlantic, just like I did. Mr. Matt Hughes, how are you doing today, Matt?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
That's true. You were born in Liverpool, right?
I was born in Liverpool, and at the age of 5, my family got on a big boat and we went to Canada. So I grew up in Canada and stayed there until my 50s.
Well, we are fascinated to speak to you today. You have a very storied history. But before we begin, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
I'm doing well, thank you, Roland, and thanks for joining us, Matt. So yeah, you born in Liverpool, then you moved to Canada, where I am. So yeah, we all have a connection today. So yeah, listen, this is great. Like you've been writing for a long time, and you've written a lot of so sci-fi and fantasy is sort of your jam, right?
I have to correct you there.
Oh, okay.
I actually started out to be a crime writer.
Oh, okay.
And wow. I was selling stories to Alfred Hitchcock, and I won an award from the Crime Writers of Canada. Had a novel out from Doubleday, Canada. And then an old fantasy book that I'd written that didn't do well, like 10 years before. I found a publisher for it, and it also didn't do well, but they wanted a sequel. And then a very big editor called David Hartwell, who loved what I was doing, I'd been reviewing it. He said, why don't you do me a book? So I did him a book, and then that led to other books and stories in magazines. So I am actually a crime writer trapped in a science fiction writer's career.
I think that's hilarious. What a way to describe it.
Yeah. Well, and you've written a lot of sort of, I guess, short stories that have gone into different sci-fi and fantasy publications, though, right?
Yeah, I was a regular at the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. I had 40-something appearances there.
Wow.
And the fact that I write somewhat like Jack Vance, who is a favorite of many great authors and editors, that drew the attention of Gardner Dozois, late wonderful science fiction editor, probably the best science fiction editor ever to exist, and also George R.R. Martin. And they began inviting me into their anthologies, even though I was unknown, because they wanted that Vancian touch to add a little flavor. And yeah, so I kind of developed a readership out of that, and I've kept on with it. I write a lot of stuff that's set in a similar space opera universe to the ones Vance used to create. In fact, I've even done an authorized companion novel to one of his most famous series, the Demon Princes series, which his estate published. And also, lately I've been doing... started out as stories and then became novels in what's called the Dying Earth, the very, very far future world that he created of old Earth when the sun is about to die out and magic has come back and there's all kinds of overweening wizards causing trouble. Done quite a lot in that, and I'm having a good deal of fun doing it.
The wonderful thing that stands out to me about everything you've described is when you're a writer, you can become successful by being like a personality so people support you and buy your books, or by being an extremely good writer. And it seems like your career is powered by being an extremely good writer. You're a nobody and people liked your writing so much that they wanted to include you in anthologies and give you work. And I guess also being able to produce that work, which is another challenge many of us writers have, is actually doing the writing. So yeah, it's very exciting to speak to you in that way.
Well, very few people have written the way Vance wrote. I don't actually copy his style. I've adapted some of his stuff to mine. But he dealt in anti-heroes and a kind of loose, decadent mood that infuses the stories that the very first time I encountered it at the age of 13, I just resonated with that, and it stuck with me. And when I finally got around to writing my own kind of stuff, that's what came out of the back of my head. I'm very much Vance influenced, is what it is.
It's amazing.
And that's so interesting, though. You say Vance influenced, and yet you are not trying to mimic him or copy his style.
No. Well, his style is unique. People have tried. They've written pastiche, and it doesn't really work. If you look at that, the one that George and Gardner invited me into was an anthology called Songs of the Dying Earth. And it's short stories by contemporary and many well-established authors, people like Gaiman and Abercrombie and so on, all set in Vance's Dying Earth. And some people tried, and these are very able authors that we're talking about, they tried to do Vance, and they didn't really make it because he is quite unique. He was quite unique. I come close. I know George Martin said of one of my books that I do Jack Vance better than anyone except Jack himself, which was kind of nice to hear, you know. But I use the cliche standing on the shoulders of a giant. I'm moving on from what he did and doing it myself, my own way. And yeah, it resonates with a certain portion of the reading public, especially the older science fiction and fantasy readers. So I'm going to be a niche author. I have a limited appeal to the broad base of people who are reading fantasy and science fiction, because what I'm writing is, as people have said, it's stuff that could have been published in the 50s and 60s. It's old-fashioned, but I guess it has a certain zing to it that some people really like. You know that old saying, not everybody likes me, but those who like me a lot. That's what.
And that's the trick to being a successful writer, isn't it? You don't need to appeal to everyone. You need to appeal to that audience that's going to support you.
As long as you don't mind not being a bestseller. And I don't mind not being a bestseller.
Well, you made a career out of this.
Standard, right? Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the case for a lot of authors. Most authors aren't going to be bestsellers, right?
Oh no, not anymore. 50 years ago, I would have been what they called a mid-list author. I would have, probably done 2 paperbacks a year, no hardcovers, nothing fancy, and I would have made a profit 8-10% for the publishers, and they would have been quite happy with it. You would have seen me in those revolving racks at drugstores and so on. And yeah, and there would have been people, and the moment they saw my name on a book, they would have bought it for 50 cents, 75 cents, whatever it was in those days. But the modern corporate publishing, they don't want somebody who makes them an 8% profit. They want twice that. And so it's all about bestsellers. And if you go into a supermarket or a drugstore now, you'll see, the same couple of dozen authors up there being offered for sale of paperbacks and so on. And anybody else, this happened to me with Tor. I had a good book that I sold to them. It's called Black Brilliant, and it did better than Break Even. It got picked up by the Science Fiction Book Club. A French publisher translated it and published it, but they didn't want another one. It wasn't a howling success. It was just okay. And it doesn't help either that modern publishers, when they debut you, they put you out in hardcover. And the reason they do that is because if it doesn't sell, they can remain to the hardcovers and get some of their money back. Paperbacks, if the paperback doesn't sell, the bookseller rips off the cover and sends the cover back for a refund. And so the publisher doesn't recover anything. But, that's inside baseball.
That's what we're talking about today, though, is that idea that you don't have to be a bestseller in order to make a living as a writer, and that's an important thing for people for authors to understand, because they look at the landscape and they say, oh, to be a writer I have to be out on all the bookshelves, or I have to be in the top of the lists, but the reality is most people aren't going to get there. But that doesn't mean that you can't make a living as a writer and live the kind of lifestyle that you want to live.
Yeah, well, I've had some strategies that have helped. After my tour book, after I'd sold it and it was coming out, and I wanted to do better than I'd done for Warner Aspect, which had the first 2 books, I thought, okay, I'll write stories for the magazines. I used to read the magazines when I was a teenager, Asimov's and fantasy and science fiction and Galaxy and If and all of those. It turned out there weren't very many of them left, but I wrote a story and sent it to Gordon Van Gelder at Fantasy and Science Fiction. And he immediately sent me a contract and a check, and I thought, oh, that's great. That must be how it works, which apparently it doesn't. But he told me afterwards the story made him laugh out loud for the first time in 2 years. And so from then on, anything that I sent to him, virtually anything I sent, he bought it. And I began to develop a readership that way. And so I conceived a plan. What I would do is write a series of stories about the same character, the same setting, and he would publish them, or Lightspeed would publish them, or somebody. And then when the exclusivity period was over, I would put it together and self-publish it on Amazon. So I got paid twice. So, first time I got 10 cents a word, and then after that, I'll make a few $100 every month. And having the exposure in the magazines helped me to get the sales on Amazon.
Yeah, that's a great strategy. And I understand what you're saying. Like, I mean, there used to be a day back when we were younger, where there were a lot of magazines, or at least 2 or 3 really big ones for fantasy and sci-fi, where authors could send their books, their short stories in and get paid. And I know that in these days, magazines are sort of not so big anymore. So it's much harder to do that. There's fewer of them. I don't even know. I think they still publish some of those, but I don't know. Are they digital only now?
Well, the problem was, and I had this explained to me a long time ago now, 20 years ago, in America, which is the prime market, there used to be dozens, scores, hundreds even, of small magazine distributors. And gradually over the years, they were bought up and assembled into conglomerates so that there were only 3 or 4. And they were applying the corporate model, which means maximum return on investment. And they found that science fiction there used to be a lot. I mean, there were the mystery magazines, Western magazines, war story magazines, all these pulp mags came out once a month, digest mags they were called. They didn't sell as well as Life and, things with pictures in them, and People magazine. So they just stopped distributing, and people no longer saw them on a shelf in a drugstore or a bookstore. And of course, they didn't buy them. So it used to be that subscriptions by mail were maybe 15-20% of a magazine's sales monthly, and the rest were newsstand. And then that changed, and it went the other way around. And now most digest magazines, you just will never see them in a Walmart or a drugstore. They're just not there, because the distributors are not interested in distributing them because they don't make enough money.
Yeah. I think there are some of them now that have gone digital only as well.
Well, yeah, Lightspeed, for example, very successful. John Joseph Adams does that one, and yeah, it's entirely online, and people read it on their phones and so on. Yeah.
Now, what do you think about it? It's funny, we've had a couple of guests on talking about physical media, and one thing that we've been talking about is like men don't read as much as they used to, but one of the things that appeals to men is like small, literal pocket-sized books that you could read in like a day or something like that. And I'm wondering, do you think there is any future to looking at physical media in a different way? Like maybe it's we used to read for reading's sake. Now maybe it's like we're reading, but as part of like it's a lifestyle choice. Like people listen to vinyl or.
Well, it seems to me, and I'm not an expert and haven't done any studies or anything, but a great number of people read on their phones, and that's the way of getting text. And of course, War and Peace is going to take an awful long time to read on a phone. So, I think the print is in trouble, especially fiction. Much more nonfiction is published than fiction. And people will read that because they're interested in something. They're not just looking for that fiction reading experience of being carried away to some other place and time or whatever. Although there are exceptions, I think what we used to call nursery novels, romance stories, I think they're still booming well. Amazing number of copies get sold, even though it's essentially the same story over and over again. But,
Yeah, but I think that, a lot of people are reading those on their digital, like they're on their Kindles or whatever. They're not necessarily reading on their phones. I can't stand reading on my phone, but yeah, it's a different market now for sure. And the idea, I like that the idea of that you said about how you were selling everything twice. You're selling those short stories and then pulling them together. That's something that I've thought of before. As if I was going to write a science fiction novel, I like the idea of like putting out a little bit different, but putting out a whole bunch of short stories that sort of explore that world, and then put out a novel that is based in that world. So it's like almost like you can read them separately, but they work really well together, right? But these days, not as many people are reading the short stories, I think, and that's part of it.
I know. Yeah, that's the terrible thing. I mean, it used to be the Saturday Evening Post would have a short story and everybody would read it and they'd talk about it at work on Monday. But that's a bygone age. It's just not there anymore.
It's surprising, given that what everyone talks about the short attention spans of people now. You'd think that short stories would actually be more popular because of that short attention span that we've bred into our youth.
Well, yeah, but in my youth, it was very rare to see what they call flash fiction. 500 words. Maybe 1,000 at the most. Those were not easy sells back then. People wanted 5,000 to 10,000 word stories. But now flash fiction is, I think it's doing better than any other kind of short fiction.
But is it selling or are people giving it away, basically? Because I don't know.
I don't know. I don't really pay much attention to the market anymore. Yeah. I just write what I want to write and put it up on Amazon. I've given up on doing stories for the magazines. Fantasy and science fiction went into sort of a decline. And then it was taken over by somebody. I don't think it's come out with a new edition yet after being bought by somebody else. I used to send stuff to Lightspeed, but the last I heard they were only interested in Flash. So which may be an indicator of how the market has gone. And I don't do many Flash stories, so.
Now, that being said, you continue to have a career and make writing. Do you think that's the fact that you have spent your entire life building up this reputation, this body of work, and now you can put stuff on Amazon and basically survive off that?
Yeah, and I make some effort. For example, I have a monthly newsletter that I send out by email to about 800 people, and most of them read it. And that's how I can promote and publicize. And it's also a way of giving a free read now and then. I've got one out right now that I put out a couple of weeks ago, a story that was in a Gardner Dozois anthology that I really quite liked. And that's had a couple of hundred people have read it in the past week or so since I put it out. So, yeah, the newsletter helps. That brings people in. I've got a Patreon account, which gets me about, in Canadian money, about $1,100 a month. That's from my real true believers who give me $5 or $10 or whatever. And I have some very devoted readers who occasionally will send me a couple of $100 just because I'm there and they love what I do. So, with those, with Amazon, Patreon, and I have 2 small pensions from all those years I worked and paid into pensions in Canada. It's enough to live on. And it's really been helpful to not have to pay rent or mortgage or utilities for 18 years while I house sat and lived in other people's places, which is coming to an end now. This is the last one I'm doing. I'm just getting too old to be wandering around the world. So I'm going back to Vancouver Island, and I don't know where I'm going to be, but I'll settle somewhere.
The idea of a Patreon is something that we've covered once or twice, not too often, because you really do need a readership. You have to have sort of an established audience to make that work, although sometimes people have talked to authors who've tried to sort of get that going before they have the audience, and it's a much harder thing to do. I would imagine,
I started mine, years and years ago now, and it was when I was in virtually every other edition of fantasy and science fiction magazine, so I was getting all that constant exposure. And I started the newsletter at about the same time. And so I was keeping in touch with people who liked what I did. And it wasn't a big stretch for them to say, well, I'll give them $5 a month.
Are you giving anything to the Patreon readers specifically, or are they just signed up to support you?
And mostly they're signed up to support me. And I give the news, what I'm doing, what I'm writing, and if I put a story up on medium.com for free, I make sure they all get to know about it so they can go and read it. Often it's one they've read before, but they like to revisit. I don't put any new material on Patreon.
So is your newsletter and your Patreon separate, or are you basically saying that's your newsletter is your Patreon?
The newsletter is how I get people to sign up for Patreon.
Oh, okay.
And I also have, at the end of every book of mine on Kindle or Kobo, there's a link you can go to, and that will sign you up for the newsletter, and I will send you a free ebook. And that gets me a few new readers, every month or two. They come on in.
That's great. I mean, it seems like this is like the old school textbook way of how you used to be meant to do it. Would you agree with that, Craig? And it just seems you're making it work for you, which is,
I mean, it's the way that a lot of people would like it to work, but it's hard to do that as a new author, for sure. For an existing author or somebody who has that audience, like it's a little easier. But usually these days, it seems that the Patreon world expects sort of like some extra stuff that they aren't necessarily going to get, whether it's, special editions, or maybe it's just the updates that you're sending that's enough for them.
I think too, it's the relationship with the author. Anybody who sends me a message or an email or something, I respond right away because they're my people. The fact that they like what I do is amazing to me, and I just want to keep them liking it. So if somebody sends me a request for information or a comment or a suggestion of this, that, or the other, I immediately respond. You have to cultivate the garden. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, well, so that sort of gives us some idea of these ways that you can sort of keep making a living when you're not a bestseller, and that is, you know, those additional revenue streams, right? For you, the Patreon, and you were selling short stories and reselling them as books. What other things, like, over the years have you found? I know you spend a lot of time sort of traveling around, and obviously your lifestyle was being supported by your writing, but maybe you were doing that because of the the income level. Were you trying to live in areas that were cheaper, or was it just that you wanted to sort of live that sort of nomadic lifestyle?
I wanted to see the world. I come from what they call a working poor background, which is always wrong, because you're always poor, but sometimes there's no work. You know, that's the way I grew up. So by a series of flukes, I found myself, even though I wasn't educated and had no real training, I found myself as a kind of henchman to senior cabinet ministers and then CEOs of major corporations and political leaders in British Columbia as their speechwriter, which meant I got to see a lifestyle that had nothing to do with my upbringing. But I also always wanted to go out and see the world. As a teenager, after I left home at 17 and became a kind of drifter, hitchhiked around, you know, the way people did back in the 60s. And so when, in the early part of this century, the first 5 years or so, as a result of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, my clientele in Vancouver began to disappear, because my main client was the CEO of a freestanding major Canadian corporation headquartered in Vancouver, of which there were quite a few, you know, mining companies, forestry companies. But one by one, they were being taken over by foreign firms who would send in some regional vice president who was not going to spend enormous amounts of money on his personal profile by going out and giving speeches. So my market began to just fade away. And so I thought, well, I got a choice. I can go to Toronto, where I'll make twice as much money, but that'll be in a corporate setting. I'll have to wear a suit and tie and, you know, yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir, every day, which does not suit me. I've been a freelancer virtually all my life. I'm not a good employee, because I don't like working for people who aren't as smart as I am, and I'm pretty smart. So I couldn't see myself in Toronto working for, you know, Inco or somebody like that. And I looked around the world and I thought, if I were doing this house sitting that I've heard about, you know, I could live on that. They don't pay much, or they don't pay anything. But I'll have a place to live, and I can write and make money and get to see the world. And so I took it up. I started out originally working for a house sitting service in England, actually for 2 of them. And the first gig was wonderful. They put me in a manor house in Yorkshire that was going through a complicated settling of the estate. The people who had been there, a baronet and his wife, they'd gotten old and died, and the heir was some a nephew of hers who lived somewhere. He was in the diplomatic corps, and he was in Amman, Jordan, and he wasn't interested in an old manor falling down in Yorkshire. So they wanted somebody in there 3 months for sure, every day, because the place was full of silver and Purdy shotguns and all kinds of stuff. Would have been a wonderful thing to loot. So my wife and I went there, and we were there 24 hours a day for 3 months. And that was wonderful. It was a great gig, but then that was over. And then we found out that 3-month sits were pretty few and far between. And we ended up living in a trailer camp in the off season and wondering what to do. And then by a fluke, a lot of my life has been determined by flukes. A guy in Saskatchewan was going to be a writer in residence in BC and needed someone to look after his house and his cat for 5 months in a small town. And I heard about it through the science fiction list server. And so we went and got that job and did it. And then we did his girlfriend's place for 3 months somewhere else. And I ran into Rob Sawyer, probably the best Canadian science fiction author. I've known him for years. He said, you want to come look after my condo in Mississauga for a month while I'm away? So I went and did that. And by then I'd found my way onto the internet. And the next gig was 6 months in Northern Ireland, looking after 2 huge wolfhounds. And after
that sounds wonderful.
Oh, it was. They're wonderful dogs. And then there was a few months in the Olympic Peninsula in the States, and then Australia, 4 months, and New Zealand, and it just, after a while, because we'd had so many good sits and good references, my wife and I became kind of A-list. So we got gigs. We were either number 1 or number 2 on people's lists. Which was wonderful. So we literally traveled around the world. And I've lived in 13 countries and visited a whole bunch of others. And it's been quite wonderful. The only drawback to house sitting is you don't know until you arrive if the people you're going to sit for are crazy or not. And we had a couple of crazies, but we survived. And sometimes... sometimes things were not as advertised. The fellow who had us come and look after 25 alpacas in France, he said, oh, they look after themselves. Well, like hell, they don't look after themselves. You got to look after them every day, and they spit on you, But, it was
I have a lot of friends who keep alpacas in France,
life.
and I can absolutely attest to that.
Yep. Anyway. But the thing was that living that way on other people's pad, really, it allowed me to live on what I was making, and then my pensions came in when I was 65, and that helped. And all in all, it's gave me a life I never would have expected. I was very happy in it. And then my wife left me for a 2-year-old. And it was just me on my own. We finally had a grandchild, and it was a girl, and she'd always wanted a girl, and I'd put 3 boys into her, poor thing. So she said, that's it, I'm going to go be a nanny. Yeah. So
you see, you can tell that you're a very good storyteller, because you threw that in there, and I saw Craig's face, like, and I was there, and I'm like, wait, what does he mean by that? And then you told us, and it was like a satisfying denouement.
Yep. Oh, I've got all kinds of those things to say. I haven't yet discussed my upbringing as part of a family that was rife with minor criminals, which is why I became a crime writer. And my take on that is I tell people I'm the white sheep of my family.
Well,
did you ever...
Oh, no, Craig, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask whether you still continue to sort of even combine the two, where you write science fiction and fantasy, but throw some crime stories into them.
Oh yeah. I have a whole series of short stories, 4 novellas that PS Publishing published, and 2 novels about a character called Luff Imbri, who is my favorite character, and he's in a space opera universe. A rather unlikely far future when there's a civilization called the 10,000 Worlds that extends down the arm of the galaxy. And he is a master criminal. He is a forger, an art thief, a con man. And I modeled him on, nobody remembers this guy anymore, Sidney Greenstreet was the fat man in The Maltese Falcon. And he was also the rival restaurant bar owner in Casablanca, a huge white-haired Englishman with a gravelly sort of sepulchral kind of voice. And I made Luff Imbri based on him as the fat man. I've had a wonderful time with him. I'm even thinking of doing one more novel involving him, because quite a lot of my readers think he's their favorite too. But again,
it's funny. As soon as you said the fat man in Casablanca, I'm like, I know exactly who you mean.
Yeah, with the little Turkish fez on and so on. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And a number of my other characters. I have a thief by the name of Raphalon, who has very good skills but very bad luck. And I did, I think, 9 stories about him in fantasy and science fiction. Originally, one of them was for that best-selling anthology Rogues. That's where I introduced him. And then I thought he was such a good character, I'd do all of his life up to that point. And henchmen. I do henchmen because I was a henchman. And people have said that one of the distinguishing characteristics about my characters is they're not the guy who's usually the hero of the story. There's some spear carrier, and I shift the focus onto them and tell their story against the background of all the big things that are going on. And I found that this is a little self-indulgent, but I don't care. What I like to do is, if I've had a novel, I will take a minor character from that novel and make them the main character of the next novel and see how things work out for them. And I always find that to be fun.
Yeah.
As a reader, I find that really rewarding.
Yeah, you see that a lot in romance, where they have the main characters, and then one of them has a friend, and then they spin that friend off into the next romance novel. Yeah. But yeah, it sounds like you picked the lifestyle that also supported, not only allowed you to live on other people's dime in their houses and such, but it the fact that it brought you new experiences in new places, which is so key to being an author, right? Is having meeting all those characters, seeing the world in different places, living in areas that you wouldn't necessarily have chosen for yourself, but it gives you sort of all these different viewpoints that are great for building stories.
And even before that, authors generally don't have some of the experiences that I've had. I mean, I've sat in the executive suite with some CEO of $1 billion utility company, gas company, meeting with his senior execs. And I'm there because I'm going to write the material, the speech or whatever. So I actually get to see what most people don't get to see behind closed doors, which is how really powerful people operate. And again, I've sat in rooms in Parliament where 2 senior cabinet ministers are working something out between them and how they actually do it. So I don't have to imagine, what some old king would be like with his court, because I've seen it in the modern sense. And there are little things. I remember one guy, quite a nice man, not a terrible person at all, but he was the CEO of this big company. And something I noticed, a little detail, somebody would be talking about something around the table, and he would not wait for that vice president to finish talking. He would just start talking right away, and everybody shut up and listened. And that was just like the king with the courtiers,
I think CEOs are modern day kings, right?
Well, some of them are.
Yeah, I mean, the money is, everybody sort of like, they're drawn to the power and the money, and they let those people run wild.
Yeah. Well, in the 90s, I remember thinking of 2 or 3 people that I knew of who were considered to be visionary CEOs, who were just psychopaths. They had massive self-confidence and absolutely no competence to do what they were doing. I mean, one guy ran the telephone company in British Columbia, which, was over 100 years old. He just ran it up onto the rocks, and it ended up being bought by the phone company in Alberta. but he was a visionary CEO. I was engaged to write their annual report, which I did, and it won an award. That was nice. And then they called me back the next year, and the CEO, the new guy, was in charge. And I was 6 weeks into interviewing people and getting background and all the rest, when the two executives that were in charge of the project said to me, "What do you think this report is about?" And I said, "You're supposed to know that. It's your company." And the whole place was in chaos because they had this hard-charging visionary CEO who was trying this and trying that and had no idea what he was doing. Of course, the industry was changing drastically at the time. Long distance used to be where they made all their money, and now it wasn't, and they didn't know what to do.
It amazes me you can win an award for a company annual report. What kind of award was that?
There were reports for design and writing and so on. Yeah, within the industry.
I always think the annual report is just sort of like a technical or a sort of a financial report on how the company's doing.
No.
Think of it as. Oh, okay.
No, it's a prestige thing. That's why they paid me enormous amounts of money to write it. They could have had some guy in the PR shop do it, but they wanted, they wanted something to say, "Here we are with this wonderful company," and be impressed by us.
I think that's I think that's another thing that authors have to keep in mind is that, writing books, writing novels are not the only income stream for writing. And as you say, you can make a lot of money as a speechwriter or writing annual reports, which I didn't know was even a thing. And, there's all sorts of different income streams. And when you have so many of them coming in together, they sort of add up to, more than...
Yeah, if young people ever asked me, I want to be a writer, what should I do to make a living at it? I'd say become a commercial writer. There are people who have large budgets who will pay big chunks of it to get what they want. If you give them what they want and give them the best quality. I remember once I was just really getting started in it, and I was getting like $500 Canadian a speech. And one of my clients was the local regional office of the Royal Bank of Canada. And I was in there one day getting information, and they said, "Listen, we will gladly pay you $1,000 a speech as long as you're always available." And I said, "Oh, I could charge a flat rate." And so I did. I started charging $1,000 a speech, because if they were paying me, everybody else could pay me. And ultimately, it was $2,000 a speech by the time I quit, which, given how long it took me to do a speech, was like $200 an hour, which is not bad money for writing.
No, absolutely not.
No. The only trick is you have to be really good.
Yeah, well, speech writing, I think, is another skill altogether.
It's rare, actually. Yeah, you have to be able to write for the voice, and to write for the voice of a particular person.
Yeah, and you want to make sure that your writing is convincing and draws people in, and
yes,
depending on what your goal is for the speech, you sometimes want to change hearts and minds, right?
Well, that's really always the only goal. I've actually written a book on speechwriting. I wrote it like 25 years ago, and I found it on my hard drive again and fixed it up, and I'm going to put it out in the next few weeks once I get it formatted. But one thing that I learned early on is that nobody remembers speeches. Everybody remembers the impression that was made on them by the speaker at the time. And that's the only thing to write for, is to create that impression. Which is usually not hard, because normally, especially business speeches, the audience and the speaker come from the same world. And a lot of what you're hearing is, "I'm okay, you're okay, and we're okay together." And if you can do that, they love it.
I mean, that
and
takes
also, you got to show them the future too.
Oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted you, but I was going to say that shows an awful lot of insight and understanding of what your audience is. And that almost seems to have defined your career.
Yeah, I suppose it did. I was always aware of who I was writing for and who I was writing for, if you know what I mean, for the speaker and the audience, and how they went together and how they could go together. Yeah, it was, and it's a facility that I had early when I was editing a little newspaper in a suburban Vancouver place. The owner was very right wing, and he wanted me to write right wing editorials, and I had trouble with that because I'm very left wing, moderately left wing by Canadian standards. But I found that if I wrote them in the voice of Richard Nixon, they came out perfect. And I found I could write in other people's voices. And that's what made me a good speechwriter, is I would listen to the speaker and talk with him or her, and then I get that voice in my head and I'd write it that way. So when they would go out and give a speech, and if they'd spent enough time with the text, it would look as if they were speaking extemporaneously and just occasionally looking down at their notes, because I wrote it to sound just like them. Very useful when you come to doing character in fiction.
I can imagine. Now, unfortunately, we're approaching the top of the hour, so we're going to have to wrap this up. But I mean, you just opened up a whole avenue of things we could go down and discuss with you. We barely got a chance to talk about your writing, but it has been a fascinating discussion, and I think an awful lot of people listening to this are going to be inspired by the life that you've lived. So I was going to ask, where can people find out more about you, more about your writing and everything like that?
Well, I used to have a web page, but some kind of weird server update happened and it kind of disappeared. It was matthewhughes.org. And if you go there, it simply moves you on to my Wikipedia page, which is very extensive. And that's the place where people can look for me. It's just go for Matt Hughes, writer, in Wikipedia, and everything is there. And of course, Amazon has an author's page, which is even more useful because you can read all about me and then you can go and buy a book.
Well, fantastic. Well, we will put a link to that website down below in the description of this video. So if you've been listening or watching on YouTube and enjoyed everything that Matt has shared with us, make sure you scroll down there, click on that link and go and check him out. And while you're down there, you will pass that big empty comment section. So make sure you leave Matt a comment and let him know how much you appreciated everything he shared with us today. And you could mention, your favorite crime book, your favorite science fiction novel, your favorite Canadian author. We always love to hear we always love to read all of the comments. And while you're down there, there is of course that subscribe button. If you haven't already, you need to smash that like button, as the kids say. And finally, there is that bell icon. You can click on that and get notified every time there is a new episode of Fully Booked. And of course, there will be a brand new episode of Fully Booked coming out this time next week. So until then, cheerio.